Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's NATS chat. I'm Kari Ragan, the moderator and of NATS chats, which are sponsored by Inside View Press. And tonight, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Indre Viskontas and Heidi Ms to discuss singing in the brain, how singers can integrate the latest ideas from neuroscience into their own singing and teaching. And by way of a very brief introduction, these ladies both have extensive bios that I hope you'll look up. So I cherry picked a few interesting things. And so let me just take a moment to introduce each of them. Dr. Indre Viskontas is a neuroscientist, opera stage director, and science communicator across all mediums. She is an associate professor of psychology at the University of San Francisco, where she runs the Creative Brain Lab. And she is also the creative director of Pasadena Opera. Dr. Viskontas received a BSc in psychology and French literature from the University of Toronto and an MM degree in vocal performance from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA. Thank you for being here tonight, Dr. Viskontas.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Reading your bio makes me feel like I've been sitting around twiddling my thumbs for the last few decades.
I hear you on that one.
But Heidi, yours is equally impressive. Heidi is a Bay Area performer, educator, and scientist who has performed on national and international stages. She graduated with double degrees in biology and music from Oberlin and a master's in biochemistry at the University of Pennsylvania. Her interest in voice science came from her work in the lab of the late Richard Miller at Oberlin, whom she met at age 17. In addition to a private studio, Heidi teaches voice and voice physiology at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. So thank you both for being here. I'm so looking forward to your wealth of knowledge on this very deep subject that can be quite complicated, I think, but you're helping to bring it into our field more readily. I want to start I love doing a Beyond the Bio, just something that we wouldn't read in your bio that helps explain how you have arrived here in our field. Heidi, do you want to start?
Sure. So after my education, I went on to work at Rockefeller University, which sort of trained me to think like a scientist. I worked on telomeres. So part of the Beyond the Bio is that I helped discover that the ends of DNA are looped in a wonderful lab, which taught me how to read papers, how to think scientifically, so that then when I suddenly came down with the 7th cranial nerve injury, now it's 13 years ago, which completely destroyed one half of my face as well as some muscles that are involved in the larynx, I had to retrain. And the way I retrained was through reading papers and doing various experiments. And that's sort of what really jump-started. I had always been interested in brain science. I had dabbled here and there in different courses and things, but that really solidified my passion for figuring out how we vocalize so I could retrain my muscles from the upstream perspective because the downstream wasn't responding. So I had to rewire in a way the response that I was getting from these muscles that were aberrant. So that's sort of how I got to where I am now.
All that personal experience, but you all obviously already had that deep interest in the science of everything, not just the voice.
Yes, I mean, Richard Miller is sort of renowned for imprinting passion for voice science at, in all of his students, I think, who read Structure of Singing from the time they arrived and keep referring to it. Yeah.
Love that. And Indre, how about you, your Beyond the Bio moments?
Yeah, so now that I'm back in academia and the fact that I have, too many degrees, everyone thinks that I never left academia, but in fact, I spent a decade not in academia. And that's actually what got me to where I am today. So when I finished my PhD and then I went and got the master's in music because I really felt that I wanted to spend the same energy and time developing my voice as I had developing my knowledge of cognitive neuroscience. And it wasn't enough just to take lessons and do summer programs at that point. I really needed to immerse myself. And then when I graduated from my master's, I just decided that I wanted to only do singing related things for work, like that was what was going to lead me to becoming a professional singer or a professional artist. So I did anything that I thought would remotely resemble some performance aspect. And I signed up with an agent in San Francisco, like a TV and film agent, and she sent me out on an audition for a show on the Oprah Winfrey Network called Miracle Detectives. And eventually I got the job. And so I was the scientific foil to a journalist who was a believer in miracles. And we like went around the country and we investigated people's claims of the miraculous. And I treated it as like a performance, but one that could use my science. And actually it was on that show that I realized that I really had a passion for distilling the science and showing people how what they might have thought of as like, you know, really boring or reductive, or, you know, somehow like taking the joy out of, you know, some kind of thing like a miracle, for example, would just add layers of knowledge that would make it even more interesting. And so that's eventually what got me to start thinking about music in the brain, because up until then I had really kept my two lives very separate. You know, I didn't want to reduce singing to some kind of set of, you know, equations or theories, or, you know, I just wanted to sing. So that was a turning point for me when I realized, you know, that there's a lot that could make me a better singer if I could just apply the neuroscience knowledge that I had.
Such interesting journeys, isn't it? How we get to all do what we love to do. It's just very interesting. Well, as we talked about in the pre-chat, there are so many directions we could take tonight, and we could talk for 8 hours and still barely scratch the surface. So we're going to just pick a few subjects and see where it takes us. I think I would like to start with talking about this conundrum that you brought up, Heidi, about that there's this conundrum about advocating for the benefits of singing, and yet singers are often, they feel beat up often. And so share a little bit of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, Indre just published this amazing white paper because, you know, music access has obviously been reduced over time for children and just the world in general. We sort of lost sight of how valuable music is in our lives, but now we have sort of scientific evidence that it is valuable for learning and growth in children and beneficial for certain illnesses in adults like Parkinson's. And so how I felt about that, because I deal with sort of the front lines of students of all ages from all backgrounds, that there was this dichotomy between their experience as singers psychologically and the science that shows the benefit. And when I think about that, I realize that we're really selecting for resilience, you know, not necessarily the most talented, because of how we've sort of structured our teaching and the systems behind it, which is really focused on more perfectionism and not being allowed to make mistakes and being told how to interpret rather than giving someone the freedom to interpret. And these are all things that I think we're still trying to work out. And on the flip side of that is singers come to me with a lot of anxiety, right? They come music performance anxiety, concern about, am I doing it right? And how can I do it right? And I think we know the science of what that does, you know, whether it's, you know, what stress does to the body, but how it also impacts the voice. And so I do think we can have our cake and eat it too. I think we can teach technical proficiency and correct and do all the things we need to do to build elite singers and not sacrifice this psychology that I think is really hurting a lot of some great singers out there who are just overwhelmed by the negative process that they go through.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, you know, we all know that what makes singers different is that we don't just get criticized for how we play our instrument. We get criticized for our instrument. You know, it's tied to who we are. And there's some aspects of it that we simply can't change because of our, you know, the size of our bones, or, you know, the kind of physics of it. And we also, I think we very much have our sense of self is tied to our voices, especially for singers, but I think for any human being, that's something that, you know, is very much tied to how we construct a sense of being a person, being your identity. And when you think about how this happens in the brain, there's actually a part of your brain called the insula, which is where a lot of different layers of information get integrated, like your senses, but also your internal awareness and your own kind of consciousness. It's not the seat of consciousness, but it's kind of where we think we build up this coherent sense of self. And so if you are, as a singer, being judged, and you feel that you are being judged on the basis of, how you sing, and that it ties into the sense of self, then I think that it can have, really negative impact if there is this feeling in the culture that there is a correct way of singing. And I think that's really damaging for singers if they, because it really gets at this very core sense of self. And we can talk about the insula and what it does sort of in the rest of the brain, but it's very much tied to some of our deepest emotions and our sense of who we are.
Yeah. And I think even the motor elements, the anterior cingulate cortex is also involved in this area of, it impairs sequential motor performance if there's stress involved. So if you're in a lesson and you're trying to correct, and then you're getting stressed out, you're actually going to get that process interrupted of the motor skill. It's actually going to become counterproductive at some point. And so I think, and even adrenaline and breath and all of these other sort of sympathetic nervous system events that happen when we start feeling overwhelmed. And I think I always say singing's physics, physiology, and psychology. And I think part of the job of the teacher is to sort of start to sense when we have to move on, so that you can sort of anticipate that stress response or negativity affecting the singer.
Yeah, I think that you can learn something from kind of Rogerian therapy, where I think sometimes what you want to do is give feedback without judgment, right? So then the artist can decide whether what they are doing is what they want to be doing. And of course, as teachers, you have the ability to also predict when they're going to go off the tracks. So you need to make sure that they're not going to injure themselves or do something that could lead to harm later on. But I think that in particular for singers, there has to be an awareness of already the judgment side of it can be very, very hard on the singers. And then if you just think about what does the brain learn when the singer has this mindset that they can either be correct or incorrect, and they're afraid to fail, and they just want to, show that they're good. Then when they're put in a situation where they're being criticized, all we see is this big emotional reaction, and that hijacks the learning centers of the brain. And instead, what the person remembers is the context, because that's adaptive, right? You don't want to be in that situation again. So they remember the room they were in, they remember what they were wearing, they remember all these things that are totally irrelevant to making them better singers. But if you can create a context in which you can provide the feedback but not have that emotional reaction, they remember the content of the feedback. Because it's a different learning memory system.
So I want to be clear, there's a continuum, especially for those of us in classical history, background, that there is a history in our profession of some pretty mean teachers, some pretty abusive. So I want to be clear that there is this big continuum. You're talking about even without that abuse, a normal lesson. Tell us a little bit more about, as a teacher, what do I need to look out for? How do I need to change my language? Because they're paying me to make these corrections, not in a mean way, but that's what I'm being paid for partially. That's part of my job. So talk to us.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think what Indre is saying is feedback is critical, and we are the ears, obviously it's the feedback in real time. Visual biofeedback is one thing I like to use in kinesthetic, but as a teacher, we can make sound a choice and demonstrate, for example, vibrancy. One common thing I see is, especially in adult amateurs, is that their vibrato they'll go straight tone in a passing tone, or, and that's an aesthetic choice because some people want straight tone in certain things, but they're not aware of it. It's a subconscious, motor element. So it's not a musical choice at that point. So I will say, is that your choice? Would you like to be vibrant here, or would you like to add straight tone here? And where would you like that? So that it becomes their part of the decision, right? Or if the note, we talk about press phonation or things like that, I make it like play or an experiment. So it's not that was wrong, let's do it this way. It's like, let's try it this way. How does this feel if you do it a little lighter or spinny, or imagine you're, a little fairy flitting in the, I'll start to incorporate ideas that aren't judgmental, that get at the same thing. And you can do technical directives that way, and you can do, something that's very specific or something very general in that kind of way that makes them participants in the choice. If that makes sense.
It does
Yeah,
make
I
sense.
think what I would just add to that is that, we all can tell almost immediately when we are with someone who's trying to please us, right? Like you can kind of tell, like, is the person doing this because it's joyful for them and because they want that, or are they trying to get a gold star, right? Are they trying to get a positive reaction from us? We can intuit that. And I think if it's the latter, if they're trying to please you, that's a red flag, because that suggests that the person is not enjoying the process of learning how to sing. And I think that that's really important to impart, that this is not something that, that the destination is the goal, right? It's not that, yes, you're going to win the Met competition if you take 24 lessons with me, right? It's like, you are going, you're building something that you are going to be proud of no matter what happens. And so every moment of it is worth spending time in. And so, I like to try to encourage, I don't teach singing, but when I do work with musicians at the Conservatory of Music, and I try to encourage them when they're trying to think about their practice to really, find the joy in the work and in the play, and like taking the risks, rather than seeing it as work or as a chore. So I guess that's what I would just, encourage teachers to if they start seeing a student that seems to be really emotionally involved in whether or not you are telling them that they have potential, or they're going to do okay, or they're going to win the competition, then you need to work with them to reframe their approach to their own practice, because that's not going to end well, I think, for most people.
Right. I mean, one of the best things that was said to me that sort of changed my idea of my own teaching, but no other teacher had ever said to me, and this was Stephen Smith, who wrote The Naked Voice, and he was instrumental in a lot of things that changed about my singing, but he said, my job is for you to not need me anymore. And I loved that idea, because I never had a teacher that made me feel like I had, a role in my own singing in a way. I always felt like I would hand it over and to somebody else, and that I had no ability to think about it on my own. And so I think framing it that way as well, is that, our job is not to have them need us or become dependent on us. Our job is to sort of foster this talent to get them to sort of start sensing their own artistry, being, voice, etc.
My speech language pathologist colleague has written in that we call this patient-centered in clinical work. Train people to use their instruments safely and flexibly to their personal end goals. But and I think, again, there's such a difference for me with the classical students and my own background in that versus the CCM. We just inherently, at least my generation, came to our teachers trying to please them.
Right.
That was our goal. We wanted very much to please them. So there's a shift coming in our field about that dynamic, and I talk about it as a heuristic approach, that it's not this master apprentice model anymore, but it's this collaborative or heuristic nature of teaching that I think is an important shift.
And that's across all education, by the way. It's not just, I mean, that's everywhere. And I think, and it's also, part of the Me Too movement, also part of the racial justice movement. I think this is all, there is a sense too that although, experience and wisdom have its place, coming at the sort of cost of a person's dignity is not worth the price.
Right. And I would argue pianist coaches need this information too. Some of my most sad experiences were from pianist coaches that are not singers, that wanted something very specific and there was no other way. And I could even spend, and this was when I was a professional. And I think, you know, I felt shut down as an artist. And that's, you know, I know that's not like me. And so that also had me think about what is the role of the pianist coach in giving a singer agency to interpret and find a tempo. I had a student the other day who said they had a conductor who was just completely inflexible about a tempo, and you know, her instrument just couldn't do it. And it was sort of like, no, you adapt to me kind of thing. And she was devastated. And so I think, you know, we have to be honored as artists and musicians as well. And I think we've gotten away from that a little bit in terms of having our own agency to express and think about what dynamic and tempo we want, not what someone else thinks we should do.
And also the irony is, like, now as a director, I see the last thing I want is a singer to come in and be like, tell me what to do. It's like, no, you show me what you've got. But like, you know, and that's been the case, but I don't think that you can expect the majority of singers to be able to get to the place where they can walk into an audition and have the courage to show us what they've got. If they've spent every lesson and every coaching, you know, worrying about whether or not their coach or their teacher thinks that they have the potential or that they're doing well.
Right.
Well, look, before we move to another area, I want to just take a couple questions. I want to say, Joanna Kasdan, about the white paper. So Dr. Viskontas' white paper, I did post it on the Facebook NATS chat page. I will post it on my page as well later, but it is on the Facebook NATS chat page, and perhaps we can put it in the chat box as well. It's a really interesting read, so I hope people will take time to read it. And we are being asked, is there an available vocabulary list, somebody specifically about brain structures specifically that we may not have encountered? There's nothing that I can put in the chat box tonight, but is there a website that they might reference tonight as we go? I should have thought of that. I apologize.
Oh, for where these, yeah, because we're mentioning parts. I mean,
I can send some resources a little bit later. I mean, I guess, you know, I didn't anticipate exactly which regions we're focusing on, but yeah, I mean, and I can put them in the chat too. So the one that I mentioned is called the insula. Heidi mentioned the anterior cingulate cortex.
Yeah, the dorsal.
Someone was having so we've just used the chat box, so hopefully you all can see that. Somebody said they were not seeing the chat box, but hopefully, Joanna, could you give me a thumbs up if you see it actually? That would be great. Somebody has mentioned Mindsight by Dan Siegel is a nice general audience book overview of brain and psychology, mentions the insula and ACC. Thank you, Joanna, for that. Let me just see if there's another. Somebody said they don't see the chat box. Okay, we will have to figure that out at another time.
And even things like the Oxford, you know, music in the brain, it's huge, but it's sort of bridges structure and function. It's sort of like the Oxford singing book, except music in the brain. So it's an analogous multi-author contribute, you know, to it.
Okay. Oh gosh, there's too many things coming in the question box. That's why I was like, let's try and keep the chat box separate, but I think there's a problem with the chat box. So we will figure this out. Bear with me, everyone. There was something very interesting. Could you say that title again, Indre?
Oh, Indre, yeah.
Which title?
You said it at 4:24. Sorry, all of a sudden this box has just gotten loaded. There was a couple titles that one of you mentioned.
The Oxford Music in the Brain.
Okay.
We can send a follow-up on the NATS board of like really interesting papers and references that are, I have a running bibliography as well. I also have a Facebook group journal club too for some of these ideas as well.
And Caroline Schiller has said that the chat on her screen was behind a red arrow, if that helps anyone. This is new for me. I'm really trying to keep those boxes separate this year. And so this is a bit of a learning curve. All right, let's move forward though. I loved, Heidi, one of your courses I took last June or something. And one of the things you talked about was gestures in singing, and that the singing motor skills are adjacent to the limb pathways. And when I was a young singer, we just did this more, but the students, at least my experience, don't for some reason. I don't know what the shift in generation has been, but I've really pulled like this one, if they're singing a high note to get some spin. I've had great success using that. And so I want you to talk about that and share some of that science behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I love using gestures. I think, I think we were all taught, in a recital to sort of stand still and not wiggle. I always say adult amateur, sometimes it's like that unconscious wiggling, so we get sort of frozen. And the gesture actually has multi-pronged rationale for why it's useful. But the one area that you mentioned that I think hasn't been talked about as much is this duplication of the laryngeal motor cortex that only vocal learners have, humans being the only one in our primate ancestors, songbirds. Indre knows Eric Jarvis, who did all the work on that. And Michelle Bellick did the dorsal versus ventral laryngeal motor cortex. So what happened, it's a convergent evolution phenomenon, sort of like sharks and dolphins that look alike but are different species. So it was this random duplication of a limb motor pathway in songbirds, and then in humans, they're still trying to figure out the details of that. But if you look at where the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex is in relation to the ventral, the dorsal, which controls our pitch and more refined vocal things, the ventral is more responsible for just simple adduction of our vocal folds, but the dorsal has our more complex skills like vibrancy or going high or low or intensity. That is right next to, it's actually in between hands, fingers, and lips. So it's closer to the limb pathway than it is to the ventral laryngeal motor cortex. And because of this kind of analogous pathways, some of the things that we do can in parallel sort of help that pathway. Now, I should also add there are other elements to gestures. There's the communicative elements that are inherited from primates, right? So there is that element. It's also in what I call the Venn diagram of our musicality, rhythm, dance, even language and prosody are all sort of related in our brains. And so there's that element as well, the rhythmic movement. And then you have something that it can release the breath in the back of someone sort of holding, as well as distraction. So I think there are many reasons why it works, but definitely I've looked at videos. I went through YouTube. I found videos of classical singers practicing, and like when they're Natalie Dessay, when she's vibrating, she does this, or she does a high note, she's doing this kind of, and her legato is always, and also who's the other one? Diana Damrau. Yeah, so there are a whole bunch of people that use it, and the concern is always, oh no, I don't want my students to do that because then they're going to go to the stage and start gesturing. And we're smart enough to not, I have never seen Diana Damrau or Natalie Dessay on the stage doing what they do when they practice. So I think it's an unfounded fear, but it definitely helps so many things, I find. Yeah.
Indre, something you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that also goes to this notion that if the student has this idea that there isn't, they don't have to do X, Y, and Z and then they'll be correct, right? That there's a variety of things that will lead to good outcomes, which is, so I think that's, and if they know that, then they know they don't have to do the same gesture every single time. I think the times in which I feel that the gestures can come in the way of a singer's progress or in the way of their performance is when it becomes superstitious. So when they have this false belief that unless they do the gesture, they can't do the thing, right? That becomes problematic. But if, the gesture is varied, I mean, and that's something that I think is really important to vary in practice, right? I mean, we all know this now that mass practice doesn't, space practice, basically what it means is just variability is a good thing, even though it causes, it leads to people thinking that their performance is less good in the moment, because if you do something 10 times, the 8th, 9th, and 10th time that you do it, it's probably better and it's probably pretty good. But that becomes an illusion of competence, right? You have this illusory belief then that, you know how to do it. But so variability actually is I think more conducive to long-term skill development, even though it can slow the rate of learning during the actual learning process. But we also, especially because singing has this youth bias, right? Oh, you just got to pick it up quickly. Like, you're talented. That means that I just have to tell you once and you'll get it. And to me, that really just signals that the person is mimicking. They're not actually changing their brain, because brain change takes time and it takes,
Yes.
stretching and all of this. So I think if you can induce this variability in the sense that, like, you don't have to do the same gesture, right? Like, but moving is good. It just doesn't have to be the exactly same choreographed thing, because then the person's going to get on stage and you're going to see them like trying not to do the thing that they think is part of what makes them sing well.
Yeah, it's the liberation. And actually what you just said, Indre, sort of bridges to what I loved. I think it's in Helding's book on masterclass syndrome, right? Where, students do a master teacher comes and on stage they just transform, and then, they think that's it, all my problems are solved. And, that's not long-term learning, right? That's an in the moment thing that is very hard to replicate, and that can generate frustration as well. So that's why when I use some of these things like gestures, I always try the multi-pronged thing. Is like, how many gateways can that singer think about? I always feel like the more inputs a singer has, sort of the more it solidifies. So if they start sensing something in a gesture like vibrancy, and then they see it on the spectrograph, or then they sense it kinesthetically, that imprints more than just one.
Along these lines, Heather has asked, how does using images impact the voice from a neuroscience perspective? This is a good time to chat about that.
Do you want to take it, Heidi? And then
I can talk about it just sort of like what I said. Imagery. There's two kinds of imagery. I look at audiation as imagery, and so I feel that is actually, I talk a lot about audiation imagery in terms of hearing it. I don't know if that's what you mean, because there's also visual, because I feel like whenever we perform a role, it's actually much easier to sing it later because we have the visual context of that role in our minds. But the audiation part is linked to our motor learning pathway. So when we actually hear a sound in our head, there is a motor response in conjunction with that hearing in our head. So oftentimes I'll tell singers, you don't even have to really take this day off from actually singing, but just go through it in your head and imagine how you want it to sound and that kind of thing. Because that will go through the whole, going from, the auditory cortex going into all of the premotor area, and even some motor signals are happening there. So that's one area of imagery. The other, maybe, are you talking about sort of feel it in your mask, or these kinds of other things that teachers use, that I think are great for, as long as we know it's imagery and not real, we can sort of describe it. But I've had people believe that they're putting sound here, for example, rather than observing. So it's observing versus sensing. Indre, I don't know if you want to talk about images that aren't necessarily physiological or scientific, but useful. Useful lies, as Ian Howell would say.
Yeah, I just muted myself because I believe my son is sneaking into my office.
Hi.
Okay, I'll come.
I want to know if your iPad's charged with more Tumbleleaf.
I know. No, you can't. Okay, go bye-bye. Sorry.
That always makes like the blooper reels, right?
Okay,
As the child.
Daddy, okay.
We love it. We love it.
It's real world in
okay.
Zoom. But yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Well, I wanted to add a couple things. One is that there is a technique of imagery that I think hasn't been as used in the singing world as it has been in like other motor skill learning or other athletic fields, which is actually just sitting and imagining, walking yourself through a role and without actually having to do it. And, if you want to get a sense of whether that might be effective, the answer is it can be if it's done in the right way, because when you're imagining something, you're essentially activating all the brain circuits that you would be activating if you were actually doing that thing. Now, that doesn't mean that you can, think your way out of every problem, or that you can just imagine yourself doing something, well, and then, it becomes implicit learning. But there is a positive effect of it, and we know that it can be, useful. So that's one side of it. And I think actually, someone in the chat asked about like how can students self-actualize interior feedback or monitor their self-talk. There is this, you can it's like meditation, right? You can work on these kinds of imagery exercises where they imagine themselves going out on stage and being present and not, thinking about whether or not they're singing well or they're pleasing the crowd, or, the audience is going to give them an ovation, like, so they can practice that side of it. So I think we know that, I like to say that the brain evolved for one purpose, which is to predict the future so that we can alter our behavior accordingly. And if you think about that, everything then is in this context of being able to imagine possible future scenarios. And so imagination is very strong in us. So I think that it is a tool that is often underutilized. But if the question is, imagery in terms of a particular vocal technical thing, like a person is doing something bizarre with their larynx every time they reach for a high note, right? So that already has this image of reaching, which puts your larynx up by your ears, and that's not good, right? So I think imagery also can be a powerful tool to counteract some of the problematic images that a singer might have intuitively that are preventing them from progressing, right? Like the reaching idea. So I think that you can see that, how exactly that works in the brain. We don't know yet. I mean, Heidi I'm sure can speculate in terms of how that affects, these pathways between your motor cortex and your larynx. But certainly, I think there are probably a number of different ways in which this can be helpful. And I think that's the other big principle of the brain, that there are a lot of redundancies. So the brain is a parallel processing machine. It doesn't just have one way of getting to an answer. It's actually got multiple things going on at the same time, and one of them pops into consciousness, sometimes two of them, but that might not even be the thing that's driving your behavior, right? So there's all these networks that are operating in tandem with each other, and so if you can find one that works, then great.
Yeah.
And anything specific about people that are not neurotypical that you've within the visualization realm that you've found to be helpful?
I mean, I think, neurodiversity is exactly that. It's diversity in there. I think you really have to have a patient-centered or person-centered approach, because, I use the word patient because I've just worked in that world, and the people who, are usually patients in a clinical setting, but I think that, for example, we know obviously autism is a spectrum. And so there are very different sensitivities within that spectrum. So if you have one person who comes in with, some sensory sensitivities, another person with the same diagnosis might not have that issue at all. In fact, it might be the opposite. So I think it's really important to work with the person, and to also listen. Like the other thing that I will say is that, if the majority of your students are over 18, they've had to live with their neurodiversity for 18 years. So they probably know a lot more about it than you do. And so listen to them and hear what they are saying, because I think that often they will be able to tell you what is more or less effective for them.
And I found sort of, in working with someone who was neurodiverse, but then applying it was sort of helpful to everybody, is externalizing an image. So for example, Indre's example of reaching, I'll have them throw a ball on the floor, to sort of counter physically. So they're actually experiencing a visualization, right? So things, or drawing, if the legato isn't right, I'll have them draw, employing sort of kinesthetic movement things that can be visualized by somebody or acted out by somebody who may be neurodiverse and needs that tangible, tactile kind of experience. But also for the visualization related to athletics, I don't know if anyone, I want to just give a shout out to Don Green, who, if anyone knows, Don Green wrote this book because he was coaching athletes on this very process of visualization. And he then started working at Juilliard. And then so I took, because I had a lot of, music performance anxiety, and he would give seminars there. And it was that exact process of visualize yourself, before the audition, even getting dressed. I mean, going through every micro detail of the experience, even elements that you think are unrelated to the actual experience, because then your brain sort of gets this rehearsal, right? Because you never know when that nervousness is going to kick in. Is it right before, or is it when you're putting your outfit on? Is it when you're sitting in the hallway with all the other singers and you're looking at them going, oh my God, they're going to get the part? So he actually would encourage a broader visualization experience. And I found that immensely helpful.
I did an interview. There's a NATS chat archived with him.
Okay, yeah, he's fabulous.
About 3 or 4 years ago, so people can find that. He was very interesting. I'm so glad you mentioned him, Heidi. Thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody has asked if you could expand on the throwing the ball idea.
Oh, I think there's so many things in music and written music that are counter to our instrument, right? Written music, we have a sense of up and down. Our voice, there's no sense of up and down, right? Even the log scale of hertz, right? Our brain doesn't know that this is the Western configuration of music, right? They, yet a half note is literally wider in our brains, higher than it is lower. But there's one part of our brain that's calculating this is just a half step, and then there's another part of our brain going, but that is like 1,000 hertz wider. And so we have these conflicts. So sometimes we have to do things to show that what we've overlaid as a construct of high and low is actually not real. And so ways I get at that are throwing a ball for a high note, for example, is that getting our brains to say this is low, or even squatting, or just doing something that really counters high versus low. Same with the legato and drawing. Notes aren't quantal. They're quantal on a page, but they're not really quantal in our brains and voice. So things like that, there's lots of strategies you can do. I call it tricking the brain. Even for people who are thinking this is a high note and the larynx jumps up, I have them audiate 2 octaves lower. And that can actually help. If you hear the note, I have to sing Queen of the Night, I have this high F, I'm going to hear the F3 in my head, and then all of a sudden that is easy because the brain says, oh, I'm just going to sing that. And then you trick it, you say, psych, I'm going up here. So stuff like that we can do. We can trick our larynx a little bit more than we realize.
And if you want to, sort of put this in context in terms of the 2 systems in the brain that you've probably heard about, system 1 and system 2, where you have the system 1 that's automatic, intuitive. Some people call it, your gut feeling. It's basically all of the stuff that happens below consciousness, which really drives most of our behavior. But we think most of our behavior is driven by system 2, which is the rational, deliberate, thoughtful, effortful, system in the brain. But system 2 is lazy, and people forget about that. System 1 will present an option, and system 2 will take it and be like, yeah, that sounds right, let's go with it. So I think that providing variability, what you're doing is you're giving system 2 other options, as opposed to just the easy, association that system 1 is given them.
Well, let's move towards our third area, which we've touched on kind of around the bout, but not, we haven't dove in. Singing teachers focus on techniques, but what about how to practice? And I will just say up front, for those people that have are regulars to the NATS chat, I of course have had Lynn Helding and Lynn Maxfield on, and we've talked about this as well. So there's a couple NATS chats about that, but I'm really eager to hear your take on it, both of you, about this, how to practice to be really effective in our learning.
Yeah, Indre.
Sure,
Indre teaches the course on this, and then I'll talk about the singing specific after Indre goes.
Yeah. Sure, and I will say, like Lynn's work is great. There's a chapter that she wrote for, I think it's Your
Scott
Inside
McCoy.
Voice.
Yeah,
Your Inner Voice. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I always get those things wrong, but I couldn't have written it better myself. Like she is spot on in terms of sort of, I think, what are the fundamental ideas that when I teach students, whether they're singers or not, how to practice, they have to know all that first. But then we can now, so now if you know, assuming that that's mainly known here, what we can move into is I think neuroplasticity, which is sort of how the brain changes with training. And it's important to learn that, you know, our brains do change. That's exactly how, you know, learning sets its, you know, has a physical, neuroanatomical, functional, you know, signal or change in our brain. That's how we learn. But, you know, the brain also habituates. So it once it knows how to do something, or thinks it knows how to do something, or does something multiple times, those circuits get, you know, they get tighter, they get more efficient, they get faster, and then it's really hard to undo them, right? So I like to sort of, you know, talk about like when you're first learning something, it's like a ski hill where there's like a powder, so you're slow, but you can go anywhere you want. And then once it's like, you know, ingrained, it's like it becomes more automatic, but it's like a slalom where like it's really skied out. So you go very fast, but it's hard to go in places where, you know, you have to forge your own path. So we see that in the brain. So the first thing that's really important when you're practicing is to be strategic about where you are in your skill set along these two paths, right? Are you just learning? In which case, you know, you have more options, but, you know, the rate of learning is going to be slower. And so like you can do a variety of things. Or are you skiing down that slalom course, and do you need to undo things, which has, you know, is a whole other way of then, you know, how you would practice that particular skill. But neuroplasticity has its biological limitations too, right? So it's not like the brain is infinitely plastic. You don't want it to be, because if it was infinitely plastic, you wouldn't remember things that happened 30 years ago. Like those would have been, you know, kind of rewritten by what's happened since. So with that in mind, I think it's really important to sort of be very overt about not only like what your goals are in your practice sessions, what feedback you're going to use to judge whether the strategies that you're trying are working, and then to understand that learning is not incremental, because if the brain is going to change physically, there needs to be a leap, right? So instead of learning sort of being just like this little step-by-step thing, what we see is a stepwise curve, right? So, you know, learning is fast at first and then you plateau, and then it's fast again and then you plateau. And so recognizing where you are in that skill, are you at the plateau, or are you, you know, firing up in the initial learning phase? Because in order to get out of the plateau, you need to change the way you're mentally representing the task. There needs to be some leap. And that's why I think some students plateau and they don't make that leap, and they get very comfortable in that zone, especially if they have had this internal self-talk that there's one right way of singing, and now they've gotten there, so now they're scared to take any risks or do any, you know, because they might lose that gain, right? They might lose, and so I think that, anyway, that's, I've been talking a lot, but those are some ideas I think of how to like approach practice if you have this understanding that there will be times when you will have plateaued. So when that happens, you need to recognize them and figure out how you're going to vary your practice now in order to make that next leap. Or you're going to, you know, go to hear a new idea from somebody. I mean, this is actually where master classes can be really effective, because they can generate a leap, and they don't necessarily have to, but they can generate like just a change in how you think about what it is that you're doing. And then also to know that, you know, when you're in this open ski hill, you know, place, you can go a lot of different directions, and that the slow rate of learning is actually okay, because once it's, you know, been solidified, once those plastic changes have happened, it's a lot harder to get out of them, or change them, I should say.
Yeah. And I think this is so helpful that we know all of the cognitive elements of learning. And I think what I would like to bring to the table for our field is what makes singing different, and therefore what can we think about specifically that makes this practice and plasticity marriage actually work. Because I think we have the wonderful aspect to vocal ped is we have a rich history. And sometimes, you know, in science, every field in science has history. What's fascinating is like the field I was in, you know, in molecular biology, it changes in a month, right? In neuroscience, it changes very fast. But I feel like there's a lot of holding on to even things like scales or certain exercises that have been in the vernacular of our field for a really long time. And they are useful, but we have to know why our students are practicing those. I always say, ask why. Why do we want them to go home and do scales on a vowel? And so I'll say, we're practicing scales on a vowel. That's what we're imprinting, you know. So I try to access sort of, and that's what I learned through this, is access the motor literature on singing to be able to then design targeted exercises that are much more specific, sometimes even really reductionist, because there's 100 muscles going on when we sing, and it's a very complicated process. So if we're just doing the same scales every week or having our students go home and do this kind of same set of exercises, we're basically imprinting that over and over again without a clear directive of what we're looking for. And so that's sort of where I feel the motor, you know, the neuroscience of vocalization, particularly from the motor level, can really inform the best way to practice. You know, I always say what to think about when is the holy grail of singing, and it will be in practice as well. And what sort of feedback also, you know, in the teacher studio, it's the teacher's ear and the student. And one thing I didn't mention about the dorsal and laryngeal motor cortex is that during singing and vocalization, our auditory cortex is actually suppressed. So we can't, that's one of the reasons why we sound funny to ourselves. But the suppression, it's minor because it goes to the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex. There's an auditory function of our dorsal laryngeal motor cortex. The reason for that biologically is they wanted the motor and the feedback loop to be really close so that we could respond vocally really fast. So that was sort of the evolutionary reason. But to that, you know, to that idea, in the practice room, what feedback is the singer getting, right? All these other fields. So that's, I think, talking about feedback is really important. Having our singer go home and say, what are you looking for? What am I looking to feel? That's why I really love visual biofeedback, you know, even if it's simple, even if it's vibrancy, or even if they can see, you know, an onset's under pitch or their vibrato's under pitch, those kinds of things are simple metrics they can follow. And then giving them really simple targeted exercises that they can do. But the idea that every singer should have the same set of exercises that they're practicing every week, I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot with imprinting something that we may not. That's where they come back and we say, oh, you know, what happened there, kind of thing.
Before let me just, there's some questions that I want to, the reference that we were making was to Lynn Helding's chapter called Brain in Scott McCoy's new book, Your Voice and Inside View. He has a 3rd edition out and she has a chapter in it. And that is what Indre was referring to, that was written so beautifully. Of course, she also has many articles out there on practicing, and of course, her new fabulous book that launched a year ago called The Musician's Brain. So I wanted to clean that up, that resource. And then Indre, did you mention a book with Sam? The last name or the first name was Sam? Somebody is asking about.
So I think that was probably the Lynn Helding.
Okay.
Someone else asked about System 1 and System 2, and
Yes.
those terms were coined by Daniel Kahneman, who Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist. But he wrote a brilliant book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is dense, but basically explains in detail these two systems in a way that I think is quite accessible. But you know, yeah. It's dense.
Yeah.
And also, I love this question about, are there any recommendations for readings or authors about how to unlearn or undo, or not even, I would just like to know your thoughts as well. How do you practice in order to undo before you can build? I mean, that's a big thing in the voice teacher community.
Yeah. I mean, I only know anecdotally, just because that's what I had to do basically, is rewire, you know, undo a pathway of doing something and reapply. I don't know of any books. Indre, do you know of any books? The papers I read, believe it or not, that were the most relatable and most helpful were on phantom limb patients, because they have to unlearn the idea that their limb is there and not feel the pain. And imagery is used a lot. For me, it was mentally audiating different sounds that I wanted, and experimenting without worrying about mistakes. And I think that's another thing singers don't feel like they have permission to do. You know, at the end of every lesson, every singer I let sing through whatever the heck they want with a fun directive that's sometimes silly and ridiculous, just because they need that play. They need to get back to sort of the love and fun of it without any correction or any judgment. And I think when we're unlearning a skill, I don't even like the negative. I call it like redirecting, you know, it's like, you know, putting some myelin sheath over this neuron instead of this one kind of thing. So rather than undoing, I don't think we want to say undo, it's just redirecting. Realize that there's going to be mistakes, and that's good, because it's like, yay, I'm not doing, you know, celebrate that, celebrate the mistakes, because that shows you're trying something new and you're trying a different path. So that's how I'm a little hyper positive sometimes, but I find that it's, you know, people feel more satisfaction in that way.
Yeah, I'll make just one comment about that too. You know, a lot of people tell me like, oh, you know, you study music in the brain and music is so great. It's like the only thing we know of that activates the whole brain. And I try to tell them like, yeah, if you're an amateur, because professionals have a very fine-tuned system and their whole brain is not active. Because, you know, and in fact, if you see like brain scans of professionals, whether they're pianists or singers, what you see is more fine-tuned specific brain activity rather than global diffuse brain activity. And that parallels the behavior, right? Like, so when a person is first learning to play the piano or learning how to sing, they're doing all kinds of things that they don't need to do. And in part, the teacher's job is to take away the things that are unnecessary, so that only the minimal effort required is there, right? So that you don't incorporate anything that doesn't need to be there, which can result in tiring and muscle fatigue and injury. So the brain is the same way. So if you're trying to undo something, instead of trying to think about it as undoing in a singer, what you want to think about is giving them a more efficient pathway to get to where they need to be. So having a better sense of what in fact they should be doing or should be focusing on, and then slowly making that pathway more efficient. That's really what's ultimately going to lead to the desired outcome, which is that they rewire the brain. And you know, just to give you an example of how powerful this can be, you can look at videos of Gabby Gifford, who was the congresswoman who was shot in the head in her left frontal lobe, which is where language production resides. And you can watch how she completely loses her ability to produce language. And then using music therapy, something called melodic intonation therapy, she essentially rewired the right side of her brain. And she's not the only one. There's lots of, you know, we see this in patients who are able to do this ultimately with this kind of therapy. And it's the fiber tract that sort of parallels on the left side of the brain, the fiber tract that goes from what you want to say, like your comprehension module, and your production module, what allows you to physically say that. That's a really thick tract in people who are left lateralized for language, which is actually most of us, even if you're left-handed, and for singers. So singers have this big, thick, you know, tract there. So we know that actually singing training even thickens that. But on the right side, for most people, it's thinner, but not for musicians. So musical training thickens that same analogous tract on the right side of the brain. If you're curious, it's called the arcuate fasciculus, which is really fun to say.
I was just typing that in the chat.
Arcuate fasciculus. But anyway, you know, you can see that rewire with melodic intonation therapy in a person with a brain injury. You can see it thicken in musicians with musical training. So that's sort of a physical example of how this rewiring works. But it's, you know, painstaking work.
Yeah,
So
and
I'm
this
reading.
is similar to sort of what I was doing as well. I mean, not as bad as Gabby Giffords, but that idea of, you know, my premotor area had a different definition of the signals it had to send. So it had to experiment, you know, going from through that arcuate fasciculus to vertices to Broca to then decide, okay, what combination should I recruit now? I mean, I always give the example of P, because I used to say P because it was this asymmetry. So I had to recruit, because there are about 9 muscles that are sort of miswired for me to say P. And so the brain is capable of doing those kinds of things, but it has to be looked at not as unlearning, but as redirecting for efficiency.
Before we move on to our last little area of topic, I want to just answer, it was Don Green that was mentioned, that Heidi mentioned about the visualization, and he has a couple books. And I know there was one that he said is the one, Performance Success versus Audition Success. I think it's his Performance Success book that he recommends the most, and you can find it on Amazon. So Don,
and he has a great website too. It's Green with an E.
With the E,
I could write it in the chat too.
An E at the end. So Heidi, you once also said that, and I loved this idea of expression and syntax should be last. And I could read more of what you said. I wrote it down verbatim. I loved it, but I want to talk about that with you a little bit. What did you mean by that?
I think when we look at even just anthropologically and biologically why we sing or why we make music, you know, there's an important level of spontaneity and personal expression that needs to be dynamic and live in the moment. And I think we need as singers as such to then, you know, we can talk about the term automaticity, because I know we've talked about that too, because automaticity isn't fully automated. It's the ability to sort of change direction, but we want that motor skill to feel comfortable enough so that in the moment of expression, we can make choices about that expression. And so if you are laying expression too closely with imprinting a motor skill, then I feel you sort of restrain. It goes back to even what we were talking about with gestures. If you associate that too much, then if it goes awry, or if a different emotion or feeling or sentiment, or you're in a big space versus a small space and you have to adjust, you're going to be limited if it's too coupled with interpretation. Now, so I do think emotion, character, affect are extremely useful as a part of laying down a motor skill, as a tool. If you talk about tools, and I use those all the time in terms of, you know, for example, if you sing a sad song, happy, you will get a different energy to it that you may want to include in your motor skill, right? You don't want to sing Nacht und Träume because it requires a certain level of intensity and energy and super sad and pathetic, because then you'll, not pathetic because it's not that kind of song, but you know what I mean, something that has that attached to it, because your voice will respond in a way that may not be the right motor skill for it. So my point is, emotions can be tools, but you don't want to necessarily have that embedded with the motor skill so soon. So you can independently create motor skills from all of these different directions, lay that down, and then you have the freedom in performance to be dynamic, if that makes sense.
Makes great sense. Indre, anything in that area for you from your expertise?
No, I'm just listening and enjoying.
We did have a question about music anxiety. Does that fall within your guys' field of expertise?
Yeah, so actually, you know, I just started this creative brain lab at USF, and the first study that we just launched is on anxiety related to being creative. So it's a specific type of anxiety that is actually, you can distinguish it from general anxiety. It's a little bit like some people have math specific anxiety. So I think there is anxiety related to performance. I don't know if we can say that it's music specific. It might be if you have, you know, this idea that your self-worth is tied into how well you perform as a musician, or, you know, like, I recently just got a heartbreaking email from someone who said that she's 64 and she's been trying to, read music her whole life and she still can't, and what is wrong with her brain? And it just makes me so sad. And it's just like, you just haven't had the right training. Like it's not, anyway, but so I think that anxiety is its whole, we should do a whole chat on that, right? Like this is not that we can probably cover in like a minute or two, but I will say that generally there are sort of two pieces of advice that I give to musicians who are struggling with anxiety. One is to figure out why they feel that their performance has some life or death, thing through it. What is it that makes them think that anybody cares whether or not they humiliate themselves on stage, right? Like, you put it that way, it's a kind of a joke, but the truth is that the threat that they are feeling is not based in reality. The worst that they can happen is somebody will say something mean to them, maybe they'll lose a job, maybe, but no one's gonna die, right? Presumably, right? So and usually one bad performance, I mean, I guess if you're super famous, that could potentially affect your career, but most audiences are forgiving. So anyway, so that's the first thing, is to figure out what is causing that threat alarm system. And usually it's a mindset problem, in the sense that they feel that their self-worth is tied to whether or not they make a mistake or sing well, as opposed to they're an artist and they're giving something beautiful to their community, and everybody should just feel so lucky to be able to receive it, right? That this is like a gift that they're giving, and so it's not something that, anyway. So that's the first thing, is to figure out why they feel that if they fail, that's going to be the end of the world. The second thing I will say is that understanding how the autonomic nervous system works, which is this sort of balance between your sympathetic nervous system, which we know is involved in sort of the fight or flight response, right? So when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your heart races, you get that sort of panicky feeling. But it's also counterbalanced in the majority of the time by the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest, right? So these two nervous systems are essentially in balance with one another. And the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic is that we call it sympathetic because it actually has all these linked bundles of cells that they want a response to be really quick, right? So it's linked so that everything happens at the same time. So that's why, like, you lose control of your bowels, but at the same time your heart is racing, you know what I mean? Like, all of it happens because there's a bear. Okay, so you got to get away from the bear. The parasympathetic nervous system acts more independently. So those things are not synchronized. But because the sympathetic nervous system is this strong synchronized thing, it can't sustain activity for very long, right? So if you go into, and I mean, the biggest example of that is you have a panic attack. But people don't die from panic attacks, actually. They feel that they will, they think that they will, because it feels awful, but eventually the sympathetic nervous system has a shutoff, automatic shutoff valve, whatever, that takes you into parasympathetic rebound, which is actually a great place to perform from. So instead of trying to keep that sympathetic nervous system at bay, I sort of say to them, look, let it wash over you, like lean into it. Because if you can do that backstage, by the time you get out on the stage, you're going to be in this beautiful place. But if you keep trying to hold it down, you're going to be super tense, and you're basically going to be fighting against, this reaction. Sorry.
I always say it's like driving. How they say when you're driving on ice, to like turn in with it, kind of thing.
That's right. Turn in, exactly. So that exactly same concept. But yeah. So here, and I think most people find that the fear of a sympathetic nervous reaction is actually scarier than having a sympathetic nervous system reaction, right? It's the fear of the fear. And then that comes to it, and they think, oh, but if I have performance anxiety, my throat is going to close up and my mouth is going to get all dry and I'm not going to sing well and all that kind of stuff. And so, like, if you can teach your brain that actually it's going to be okay if you just let it go through and then, have a sip of water or whatever you need to do, and then walk out on stage, you know, rather than worrying about, oh, this is going to continue to ramp up, and then, you know, my breath is going to be, you know, shallow and so forth.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to, you know, what happens before all of that, right? Sort of what we were talking about with imagery and strategies so that you don't even get to that point. I mean, and I think honestly, the two things, you know, is even goes back to the original thing that we began with, is how we're training singers to perceive their own performance, right? If they go in thinking they have to be perfect or please or those elements, or really judging every sound that comes out of their mouth, it's not conducive to a performance mindset. Or if they haven't imagined themselves go through this and think, I honestly feel like when I'm nervous, if I do imagery going through it, I experience that sympathetic response, you know, so you can practice experiencing it for real, you know, when you sort of do imagery. So I think there's the real time moments of allowing it to go and driving into that black ice. And then there's also what can we do beforehand to at least give ourselves a chance to minimize that kind of thing.
Well, you guys are a wealth of knowledge. We could just talk on, and I can see where we need to have you on again next year's NATS chat with maybe like Indre, as you said, you could talk about the music performance anxiety as a whole topic, but I thank you for giving us those tidbits that you did. Heidi, are you going to be teaching your course that I took last summer anytime soon?
Yes, I plan on doing that again. I sort of in May, June is sort of when I've been doing it every year. And it changes every time. And then I do it through other places like Debbie Winter's voice workshop.
Yeah.
I usually do stuff like that with them too, and vocology and practice. But my own course again will be in May or June. And I don't have a web. I'm terrible at the PR stuff. So I'm on Facebook. That's mostly where I live.
You're getting around all right, lady. You're getting around. It's all right.
So I'll put it out there.
Okay, and there was some, I did not, it was not your actual paper that I posted, so perhaps you could, if there's a link and I could post it. We're getting lots of questions about where do people start about the brain and singing. You know, I of course know Lynn Helding's book is really a wonderful resource, but perhaps there's some other articles or books that you might recommend based on the conversation tonight, or that were briefly mentioned and people didn't get the titles. So if we could compile a list, and I will put that on the NATS chat Facebook page so people have access to that.
And can I just give a quick plug to the Sound Health Network? This is a new organization. It's sort of the fruit of Renee Fleming's work at the NIH and the Kennedy Center. And essentially, we are pulling together all the people, the stakeholders that are involved in promoting and conducting research on the impact of music on health and well-being. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this part of the field, which actually I think that, especially with the pandemic, there's big future. And so if you have students who are worried about making a living as a singer, this is a great way of, you know, continuing their path. And you know, everyone who works at the Sound Health Network plays an instrument. So we all know that, you know, you need to practice every day. And so anyway, I think this field is really growing. So the website, I'll type it into the chat, but it's soundhealth.ucsf.edu, and we put out a monthly newsletter. We have webinars and you know, various other events. So please check it out.
Thank you so much.
All right.
And I want to remind everyone as we sign off here that the next NATS chat will be Sunday, March 14th with my guests, Dr. Mary Sandage and Dr. Aaron Johnson, and we will be talking about managing vocal health. That will be another fantastic chat with two experts in our field. So thank you again, ladies. We will be in touch to continue this conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Ladies, if you want to hang on for a quick second. Give me